You probably know someone like this. They talk about their plans constantly, the business they are going to start, the book they have been meaning to write, the career change that is always 6 months away. They have the ideas, they have the passion. When they describe what they want, it sounds completely real and thought through. But months pass, then years, and nothing moves. The dream stays exactly where it was, in their head. And the frustrating part, if you're close to them, is that they're not stupid. They are not without ability. In many cases, they are among the most creative and imaginative people you will ever meet. So the obvious question is, what is actually stopping them? This is not a simple question, and the answer is not laziness. That word is one of the least useful words in the English language when it comes to human behavior because it describes what something looks like from the outside without explaining anything about what is happening on the inside. When a psychologist looks at a person who dreams big but consistently takes no action, they do not see laziness. They see a very specific set of psychological mechanisms that are operating exactly as designed, just in a direction that works against the person's stated goals. Understanding those mechanisms is the only way to actually address them. The first place to look is the brain itself, and specifically how it responds to imagination. When a person vividly imagines achieving something, finishing the degree, launching the product, standing on stage, the brain activates many of the same neural circuits it would use if the event were actually happening. This has been documented through neuroimaging research and is one of the reasons mental rehearsal is used by athletes and performers. The brain, to a measurable degree, partially experiences what it imagines. Now, a psychologist named Gabriele Oettingen spent decades studying exactly what this does to motivation, and what she found goes against almost everything people assume about positive thinking. She found that people who engage in purely positive fantasizing about their goals, imagining the outcome in vivid detail without thinking seriously about the obstacles, actually become less motivated to pursue those goals over time, not more. The mental simulation delivers a version of the reward before any real effort is made. The brain gets a signal that something good has happened, and the urgency to make it actually happen quietly decreases. This helps explain something that puzzles a lot of people, which is why someone can feel incredibly fired up about a goal one day and completely indifferent to it the next without anything in the external world changing. The emotional charge that comes from imagining the dream is real, but temporary. It fades quickly once the brain has processed it. And because the imagination is always available and always comfortable, the person returns to it again, instead of sitting with the discomfort that real action requires. Over time, this becomes a loop. The dreaming becomes the primary activity, and the doing gets pushed further and further into a future that never quite arrives. To understand why action feels so much harder than imagination, it helps to think about what action actually demands. Doing something real, starting something, shipping something, putting something out into the world requires tolerating uncertainty. You do not know if it will work. You do not know how long it will take. You do not know what people will think. And critically, you have to be willing to produce early versions of the thing that are probably going to be bad before they get better. Imagination carries none of these costs. In your head, the business is already successful. The book is already finished and well received. The version of yourself in your mind has already cleared every obstacle. Real action immediately replaces that clean image with a messier, slower, more uncertain process. For a lot of people, the contrast between how good the dream feels and how uncomfortable the start feels is enough to keep them exactly where they are. This connects directly to a concept in psychology called the identity threat. One of the most powerful drivers of human behavior is the need to maintain a consistent self-image. People do not just have goals, they have identities built around those goals. A person who has spent years describing themselves as someone with big plans, someone who sees possibilities others don't, someone who is going to do something significant, that identity has real psychological value. It shapes how they see themselves and how they present themselves to others. The problem is that actually attempting the goal puts that identity at risk. If you try and fail, you are no longer someone with potential. You are someone who tried and it did not work. The dream, as long as it stays a dream, protects you from that outcome. The untested version of yourself always has the possibility of being great. The tested version might not. For many people, the unconscious calculation is that the dream is worth more as a preserved possibility than as a real attempt that could go wrong. This is closely related to what psychologists call self-handicapping. Berglas and Jones first described this in research from the late 1970s. Self-handicapping is the tendency, mostly unconscious, to create conditions that explain away potential failure before you have even tried. Not preparing fully, waiting until the last minute, taking on too many things so that when one doesn't work out, you can point to the chaos as the reason. These are not random failures of organization, they're protective strategies. If you never fully commit, you never have to fully fail. You always have a reason that exists outside yourself. The timing was wrong, the market wasn't ready, life got in the way. The self-handicap preserves the possibility that you could have done it if only the conditions had been right. Another layer worth examining is what research on goal announcements suggests about social behavior. There is a widely shared belief that telling people your goals makes you more accountable and therefore more likely to follow through. In some specific conditions, this is true, but psychologist Peter Gollwitzer found something more complicated in his research. When people announce their goals and receive acknowledgement from others, they experience what he described as a social reality around the intention. The social recognition of the goal creates a feeling of progress, even though no actual progress has been made. The validation and identity affirmation that were supposed to come as a result of the work arrive early, before anything is done. And because some of the psychological need that was driving the goal has now been partially satisfied, the internal pressure to keep moving reduces. This does not mean sharing goals is always counterproductive, but it does explain why some people who talk most enthusiastically about their plans are often the least likely to execute them. There's also a structural problem that does not get enough attention. Big dreams, almost by definition, involve a large gap between where a person currently is and where they want to be. And human psychology handles large gaps in a predictable way. When the distance between current reality and the desired outcome is too wide to hold in focus, the mind generates overwhelm. Not in a dramatic, visible way, more like a quiet shutdown. The task feels too large to approach, so the person doesn't approach it. They keep it abstract, keep talking about it in general terms, keep adding to the plan without ever starting it. The solution to this is not to want less. It is to deliberately work with a much smaller frame, to focus only on the next concrete step rather than the full distance to the destination. But most people who dream big have never learned this as a practical skill, because no one teaches it. They keep looking at the whole picture, and the whole picture keeps defeating them before they begin. Underneath all of this is something that shows up consistently across psychological research on behavior change: the relationship a person has developed with discomfort. People who have spent most of their lives managing their environment to minimize friction and unease have a very low threshold for the kind of discomfort that productive work creates. And productive work always creates discomfort. It creates the discomfort of not knowing if you are doing it right, the discomfort of moving slowly, the discomfort of producing work that is worse than the standard you set for yourself, the discomfort of being visible and therefore open to criticism. These are not extreme forms of suffering, they are ordinary parts of doing almost anything real. But for someone who has never developed tolerance for them, they feel like genuine obstacles rather than just the texture of the process. Carol Dweck's research on mindset adds another dimension here. She identified a pattern she called the fixed mindset, in which a person believes that their abilities and potential are fundamentally set, that you either have something or you don't. For people operating in this pattern, attempting something difficult and falling short of it is not just a disappointment, it is evidence. It feels like proof of a permanent limitation. This makes not trying genuinely rational from a self-protection standpoint. If you don't test the ability, the question of whether you have it stays open. The dream remains possible. This is why you will hear people say things like, "I know I could do it if I really committed," without any irony. That statement is doing real psychological work. It is keeping a door open that actual commitment would risk closing. What separates the people who move from dreaming to doing is not usually courage in the heroic sense of the word. It is more often a practical capacity to tolerate the early, unglamorous stages of work, the part where the results don't look like what you imagined, the part where progress is not visible, the part where the gap between the idea and the current reality is at its most uncomfortable. That tolerance is not a personality trait that some people are born with. It is a learned capacity that develops through repetition and deliberate exposure to manageable discomfort over time. It is a skill, which means it is something that can be built. But building it requires first being honest about which of these mechanisms is actually running in your own life. Not in a self-critical way, but in the same clear-eyed way you would look at any other system that is not producing the results you want. The psychology of dreaming big but doing nothing is not a mystery, and it is not a moral failure. It is a predictable set of responses to the psychological costs of real action, the identity risk, the threat of failure, the discomfort of uncertainty, the brain's preference for the reward of imagination over the slow, uncertain work of actually building something. None of these things are personal flaws. They are human tendencies, and they are widespread because they are effective at protecting people from short-term pain. The cost is long-term stagnation, and the only real way through them is understanding them clearly enough to stop being managed by them without knowing it.